Let's continue to warm the sanctuary by rising in body or spirit to sing our opening hymn, Faith of the Larger Liberty, number 287 in your great hymn. In March of 2008, when Barack Obama was still a senator from Illinois, he found that his campaign for the presidency of the United States had become clouded in controversy over the spread of video and written transcripts of statements made by his minister, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. It came to be necessary for Obama to speak explicitly on the issue of race, because there had been accusations that Wright was a hate monger, hostile to white people, and in fact supportive of the terrorists who had carried out the attacks of September 11, 2001. Obama's detractors seized the opportunity to imply that this was in fact Obama's true position as well. So his response began with this: "We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union." 221 years ago, he went on to say, in a hall that still stands in Philadelphia, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy. Farmers and scholars, statesmen and patriots who had traveled across an ocean to escape tyranny and persecution finally made real their Declaration of Independence at a Philadelphia convention that lasted through the spring of 1787. The document they produced was eventually signed, but ultimately unfinished. It was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery, a question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 more years, and to leave any final resolution to future generations. Of course, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. And yet words on parchment would not be enough to deliver slaves from bondage, or provide men and women of every color and creed their full rights and obligations as citizens of the United States. What would be needed were Americans in successive generations who were willing to do their part through protests and struggle on the streets and in the courts, through a civil war and civil disobedience, and always at great risk, to narrow that gap between the promise of our ideals and the reality of our time. Those were the words of Barack Obama. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The words that began our Constitution and the now President's speech were written the same year that this meeting house was finished, 1787. The men who were working tirelessly on the Constitution were in deep conversation with the folks who were shaping our religious movement at that time. They had their doubts about religion, but they wanted to preserve the freedom of worship and thought so that whatever was most right and true could eventually emerge. And even with all of their skepticism in matters of faith, they dared to begin the preamble to our nation's Constitution with aspirations as lofty as any statement of faith could be, to form a more perfect union. For our religious forebears, you've heard me say before, that perfect union was with the will of God and in the destination of salvation through grace. Then it became the will of God as it could be known among us through our study of Scripture and our use of reason. And then it was the will of God that could be known through understanding God's creation in all of its magnificent glory. And then it was the will of God that could be known by understanding the ways it might be expressed in different cultures and faiths. And then it was the universal moral principles that could be understood in the best in human beings, even when we weren't so sure about God. The notions of union, of perfection, have shifted over time. They've expanded and they've contracted based on the promise of our ideals as they meet the reality of our time. In a religious community that holds democracy as a faith position, the process of engaging with both the promise of those great ideals and the sometimes disappointing reality of our time has everything to do with an ongoing spiritual, moral sensibility. It demands that we put our faith in each other. It demands that we commit to cultivating the best in ourselves. Many of us, if we were asked to name the UU principle that is most dear to us, would name the first: respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Democracy in action takes that abstract notion of respect to a whole new level, as it asks us not just to tolerate others, but to find the worth even in those with whom we disagree. It asks us to seek and find some union with our neighbors, even if, especially if, they voted a different way than we did, and likely will again. In the words of Unitarian preacher and theologian Theodore Parker, democracy means not, I am as good as you are, but you are as good as I am. In other words, we are always called to love our neighbors as ourselves. Truly. My connection with the sacred is only as secure as my willingness to acknowledge the same connection in my neighbor. And here's the real kicker. If the holy really does speak through each of us, I have to be willing to see it in Glenn Beck just as much as Rachel Maddow. The notion of a more perfect union seems to imply that we know we won't get there. The preamble doesn't say in order to form a perfect union. A perfect union might be something that could be named at a single point in time. If you get a particularly arrogant group of lawmakers in place, they might just think they had completed the job. No need for that Constitution anymore. We've created the perfect union. And it keeps us safe by condoning torture. And it lets the market rule all of our national priorities. All done. What's for lunch? The more perfect union reminds us that perfection is an eternal goal and never the final destination. The more perfect union we seek is not of eventual sameness, but of the acknowledgement of a binding force that we share even perhaps especially in the midst of difference. It's an important distinction that I think is at the core of what makes unity so challenging, both as a secular and a religious idea. Well, at first, we might really appreciate sameness. It's difference, a healthy embrace of difference that ultimately makes a union strong. The place that we see this played out most comically and most tragically is, of course, in the realm of romantic relationships. There are all kinds of things written about the beauty of the union of true love, a kind of eternal bliss in which you meld completely with another person and live happily ever after. With each glance you share at the beginning, tiny hearts float in the air between you. No difference is worth arguing over. All is sweetness and light. You're seen in soft focus, in the best light, and so is your beloved, all the time. And then morning comes. And someone, never you, has bad breath. Or someone, never you, was snoring. And then the little threads begin to unravel, and we see the ways that we experience the world differently. That there are some things that may seem charming at first that are not quite so now. My favorite story of one of these discoveries is of my friends Amy and Kelly, not their real names, who met on a blind date and were at a coffee shop where Amy got a cup of tea, and they sat and had a wonderful conversation, really connected, thought this was just terrific. Both of them were having a wonderful time. And then Kelly, as they were, deep in conversation, toward the end of their time together, Kelly, being a gregarious person who just is completely at home in the world in every possible way, reached over and grabbed Amy's spent tea bag, lifted it up, pulled off the string, and began to floss her teeth with it. This was something Amy found odd, but kind of charming. And they're having a wonderful time. Nothing more was said about the tea bag incident until several months later, well into their relationship, when Kelly began to do the same thing while they were out in public with another couple. At this point, Amy had to say something. And so she nudged her and said, "Don't do it." And he's like, "What? You did that on our first date? It's embarrassing. Stop." This resulted in one of the biggest fights they had to that point. And suddenly Kelly had to acknowledge that perhaps it was inappropriate to floss with someone else's tea bags. And that she tended to do that kind of thing quite a lot. They've eventually worked it out. But as we know, there are many things, many examples of such things that we live with. Things that cross that threshold from charm and enchantment at someone's quirks to real navigation of differences. We find ourselves having to navigate that difference when that romantic bliss wears off and see if it's still enough to get us through how we manage our money in a financial crisis or how to raise a child during an emotional one. What we find as we try to stay afloat in those choppier waters of relationship is that the definition of both perfection and of union changes with each new challenge. Union can't realistically mean agreement on each and everything, so what does it mean? And how do we improve on it so that we can continue to grow with our new understanding? How do we make it more perfect? That, of course, is the project and the process that Obama spoke so eloquently of in his speech. It's the brilliance of the project of democracy, both religious and secular. Just as the founders wrote into the Constitution the very means for the emancipation of slaves, the founders of our faith wrote into the organization of our churches the ability for our theology to embrace ever more people and ideas. Only in this kind of faith would it be possible to have an active group of pagans at the same church which was gifted with the silver chalice by Governor Stoughton, who presided over the Salem witch trials. This is both ironic and truly beautiful. None of it would have been possible, though, without the commitment and engagement of the people in each generation who have faithfully kept this church from the time of those trials to the present. They lived a commitment to sit prayerfully with the deepest place in themselves, where the Holy speaks, and then to have the courage to share that truth with the community that may or might not agree. They lived a commitment to care for each other even when they had been sorely disappointed, and to forgive even as they wished to be forgiven. And more than anything, they committed, and this is really miraculous to me, they committed to continue to show up, to offer the best of who they were in the hope that it would be enough, that others might do the same, and that somehow, together, we would all make it through. With each new generation, it's ours to breathe new life into our union, to bring the truths we know and the tough with BlackBerries buzzing and Twitter feeds hungry for more information, all of it in 140 characters or less, we crowd out any space or time to reflect, to acknowledge what's truly most important to us, to hear that inner voice of wisdom where we can discover our own wholeness. Most of us don't even get enough sleep at night, much less time for lofty contemplation during the day. So it's just easier to check things off the list thoughtlessly than consider what got on the list in the first place, and whether that is how we want to shape our lives. It's easier to let things go that don't seem to concern us directly, and let others vote on the things that they care about and hope it all comes out okay. The problem is, with everyone doing that, with everyone moving at just this speed with very little time for reflection, we end up with legislation that doesn't speak to the best in us or serve our ideals in a land of peace and justice. We end up with a patchwork that's based on activism driven by fear, governed not by emerging wisdom, but by everyone screaming the loudest they can about their pet issue, hoping they can win. That's how we ended up, freedom of the pulpit here, with our final version of healthcare reform in this nation. It's also how we've ended up with the current legislation demanding documentation of legal status from all who might seem to be immigrants in Arizona. So how in the world do we keep ourselves in sight of our ideal, given the reality of our time? That is the $64,000 question. Would it be too predictable for me to say, it helps to come to church? I don't care, I'm going to say it. It helps to come to church. I mean specifically to this church, of course. And not just to come to church, but to stay engaged at church. Democratic process is our liturgy. Liturgy literally meaning the work of our people. It's holy work. It asks us to be engaged always with the deepest parts of ourselves, the place where we touch the eternal spirit that we share with all beings. And it asks us to bring forth wisdom from that well, to share the stories of our lives together. It demands that we do the work of showing up to shape community, that we share honestly, that we offer our hearts to each other, that we question received wisdom in order to deepen our shared understanding. And it asks that we use the power we have to help shape our world, to to bend that arc of the universe ever so much more toward justice. As we enter our annual meeting, you may think you're hearing reports and voting on a budget and clapping politely for volunteers who have done very many good things. And you will be. But you're also taking important time to be part of working for a more perfect union. May we guard and protect this process of democratic church, support each other in carving out time for that which matters most, and live evermore into the promise of our faith, that difference is a blessing, that we are all one, and that hope and healing are possible. Let us sing together the power of that greater love, the union that we want to perfect as we enter into prayer, remaining seated to sing, "There is more love